first came to know the Enneagram in 1996 through a student of mine. I was teaching something connected to personality models. And then she asked me if I knew the Enneagram. And I wasn't in my hometown, São Paulo, I was in Rio. And that student gave me a lift to my hotel. And it was raining. And when it rains in Rio, there's a lot of traffic. So we ended up having an hour and a half for talking about that. And I got pretty interested because already in that very short talk, she suggested that I was probably a type 5. And then she suggested me a book. And I got the book. It was Helen Palmer's first book. And then I was truly amazed and very surprised. And then I started studying that more than anything else. For 5 years, I studied it without working with it. And I, by then, had done many courses in Brazil with a local teacher who was very good. But then I went to the US and studied with Helen Palmer and David Daniels, who later I became affiliated with and taught their program, the Palmer Daniels program, the EPTP, in Brazil, Portugal, Spain, Italy. And by then I had already changed my whole career and I created a consultancy and training company specializing on the Enneagram. And so, to make a long story short, I started working with the Enneagram in business. But soon after that, I started doing public workshops. And then they evolved up to the time that I came up with more energy-based work using the Enneagram. And this is because together with knowing the Enneagram, I got to know meditation and different sorts of meditation, and some of them helped me open my body center, my instincts, and I got pretty sensitive to energy in a way that I wasn't before. Because of the particular techniques that I was using in meditation, there was one particular moment that I just felt it blowing open. I was actually doing the whirling dance, the Sufi whirling dance, as a meditation. And all of a sudden, the movement take control of my body. And I started, whirling way better, but also with different movements that were happening because of a lot of energy that was coming to me. And other meditations, Kundalini based, and other meditations that I did at that moment also helped me get in touch with more energy, which is also something that for 5s happens during the path, because we have this limiting belief that we don't have much energy. And when we do inner work, we get in touch with life force, right? So after that, soon after, when I did a course, sort of a deep course that I used to do, and here we're talking probably about 2007, and then I noticed that I was sensing everything in my body while working with the students. And I would sense in my body what was going on with the student. And anytime that I experienced something different, I would leave the workshop and study what had happened. So it was like the experience came first and the cognitive integration came next. And then for instance, at this moment, I started studying morphic resonance. And I also had to study presence and practice presence because it was such a strong experience, and I had no preparation for that my body would move like towards the person, like if I was feeling my heart, it would move. And so I didn't have this control over my body in the beginning. One good thing, though, is that I have never in my life lost awareness and got into a trance in which I wasn't there. And another thing that I particularly really like in the way that instinct came to me is that I can turn it off. I can eventually not feel it. And as I said, I think this was instinct coming up. But soon after, I also had an opening in intuition, which is different, right? So instincts have to do with the senses, and intuition is the sixth sense. And that also came to me soon after, but also very much body-based at times, and sometimes just knowing. So it was, these were interesting moments that I was leaving very different things, and I didn't have many role models to follow, or even the necessary knowledge before things happened. I remember that even with some of my dearest teachers, spiritual teachers, I would ask them things and they wouldn't give me what I consider to be a satisfactory answer. Or they would say, look, maybe that is not so good, you need to go slow. But, you know, that was happening with me. And so I had to integrate, and I eventually found very important people in my life who helped me a lot to deal with that, to integrate. Yeah. And I think it was on this trend that I came up with this method of working with people more with energy, and then on the Enneagram map. So I was already doing deep work with people because I think one of the perks of being a 5 is to understand things in a complex way. And we study quite a bit. So I would understand somewhat easily what was happening with the student, and sometimes just give advice and, ask some interesting questions that would help the students. But then this new resource and source of information came to me, like knowing more than what was being said and more than what I was reading in between lines. It was a direct knowing in my body. So what changed is that I started reporting back to the student what I was sensing, because one thing that I've always tried to do is to respect what happens at the moment. I was trained to really work under the basis of phenomenology, like what's happening is what we need to consider and trust it. So I would sense that, and I would say, I cannot not do something about it. This must have some meaning. And then I would report it back to the student, and there would be confirmation almost always, although in a few times, not in the beginning for the student, because I was getting sensations that the student sometimes was not yet aware of. And so I would report back and use verbal communication to do some work on that, but it didn't take long until I started using those energy resources to work more directly with the student in different ways, sometimes more evidently physically, and in other times just energetically, which is what I try to do the most now. But the main integration of particular ways to do that came to me because of the work on the Enneagram mat. So I just imagined that with those things that were happening with me, and because I've always studied the process Enneagram also, and the Gurdjieffian Enneagram, that the Enneagram would unveil a lot of energy if we could have something to, the symbol itself to help on that. And I particularly had never heard of anyone doing that. Later on, I was told that some people had done it in the past, but I even don't know who those people were. And I had never seen anything. And I don't think they were doing that anymore at that moment that I started doing it. I mean, today it's very common. Many people do it, but I do think that I sort of invented my particular method on that. And that, again, was around 2007. And what I did was to first do some sessions with my close colleagues, like co-teachers. At that time, I had several people working with me in organizations, and we would do work together. And I had moved already from one meditation school that I was a student in to a Gurdjieffian school as a student. So things were coming together. And then I started using the mat, and each time there would be more learning and even more intense and energetic experiences. And I would, use the mat for myself and sense how it was to be each type. And then there would be techniques that I would learn in the Gurdjieffian school that I would bring to my practice. For instance, an exercise I learned in there that Gurdjieff called the Enneagram of emotions, like getting in and out of 9 different kinds of emotions while stepping on each of the Enneagram points. And so I started exploring, and I noticed an extra level of transformation in people because of including the body and somatics in the transformation process. There has ever been anything that I did with students that I didn't make sure that I would experience it in myself. I always try to do that. And I learned because of therapy that sometimes when I was touching some kind of content with people that either I hadn't been through, or it was strange to me for any reason, or much to the contrary, that I had gone through, but I didn't know and I hadn't worked on yet, that it was imperative that I did work on. So it would be like this. I would have one experience with the students, like for 30 minutes during a course, and I would work for 6 months after that to integrate that in me, because I've always done a lot of shadow work, and I didn't want that to stay in the shadow part of it. When I'm listening to a student's story, I'm listening to the content that's being shared, and I'm connecting to the story and to the student to get more information, both from an instinctual and an intuitive perspective. And now it's a bit more complicated because something that happened significantly later on was that I opened more my heart. So there is some heart-based knowledge that I integrate also, something that I feel in my heart. That's still pretty much in progress. It's not as much as in the instinct realm, but it starts to happen. And with more and more information about the Enneagram itself and the system and how things work and things people go through, then the intellect also comes up in ways that assessing what's happening with the client became more complex, more accurate, I think, and more interesting. And I'm always interested in getting deeper in those levels of understanding. Naturally, I'm interested in that as a 5, a social 5. But to me, it's also a blessing to do my inner work, to be able to experience and not only be in my head while teaching, and to interact and to relate. Because from a certain time, it started to be tiring for me to do more of the mental work only and to teach like a professor, you know. And I try to do that less. I do it a little bit, but I do that a bit less today. So I started using the mat almost only with the arrows. And at that time, because I had no model, I even didn't have a mat per se. I had done something different, which were straps, 9 straps. And I would assemble them in the diagrams format, taking me about 10, 15 minutes each time, if not more, to do it perfectly. And I didn't have the circle because I didn't find straps in a circular way. So it would be, and then I had small boards with the numbers, with stands. So I would do something very, in a way that wasn't as easy as a mat. And eventually the idea of the mat came up, and, you know, and I would take people to the 2 arrow connecting points. And I was lucky enough that from my very first Enneagram teacher, I got the theory right, that from her, that I needed to go first against the arrow, then come back to type, and then go with the arrow. And I would train that with what ended up being hundreds, thousands of people, because I was lucky to have lots of people interested in that in Brazil. And I was working a lot. So then I would train and get experience in taking people to the arrows. And I would start mapping out things that happened with them in both arrows, and understand more in more real terms the power of that, and always seeing the arrows more as paths for growth, and trying to take them positively, and instead of just us acting out ego when we go to one of those points. So it would be mostly that. But then you know, I started experiencing different things, and I'm always, you know, it's also my type and the mental part of me. I would always explore new things. So one thing that came right next was people who were in a doubt about their types. I would bring to the mat and even roll them a little bit in the center with the eyes closed, and many times they would go boom straight to the type that they were, without knowing, you know, just through energy. Or someone, I remember now, in a doubt between 5 and 6, I brought the person in between, and then what arm is heavier, you know, to one of those wings. And yeah, I started experiencing, and some things that I experienced did not work as well as others, and then I would discard. But then I started adding more the dimension of the Gurdjieffian laws, like law of 3, law of 7, and other things on the symbol that I was reading a lot about and studying and testing on myself. So different spaces in the symbol, different spaces, but perhaps the main one being that opening between points 4 and 5. And I was having important experiences in that Gurdjieffian school about that. And by the way, they knew quite a bit of all that. they would work with the process Enneagram. And then from a certain point, I started sharing in that school what I knew about the type. So there was some conversion in our internal studies of all that. So it would be each time at a new workshop, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then I did that in a way that I would call it the dynamic Enneagram workshop. I didn't call it way of the arrows or way of the symbol. This was actually, I think, much later on, many years later on, when B and I had met again, after both of us had been for 6 years at the International Enneagram Association's board of directors. Then we met again, and she saw me doing that, and then she promoted a workshop in California. And for that thing, I think, if I'm not wrong, it was B, or maybe even Ginger before that, who was a bit interested in that. Somehow this name Way of the Arrows came up. And then the Way of the Arrows would be explore on the mat with Uranio facilitating what the two arrow connecting points do for you. But then when we started offering workshops that went beyond that to explore the other spaces and the laws and all the process, we said we need to name it in a new way. And then the name Way of the Symbol came up. Eventually, these two became two different workshops. One to much more explore the arrows, and the other one to explore whatever comes and whatever is necessary, and work with a true challenge the person has in life. Many things. B is way better than me to create structure behind the work that we do. And that helped a lot. Also, she knew people, especially in California, that were really ready to do this work. I mean, I knew people who were ready in Brazil, in a few other places that I traveled to, mainly in Europe, a few other South American countries, but not in the US. In the US, I was very timid, shy to present that. And being a Brazilian, people would be both interested, like, oh, Brazil, is he a shaman? They wouldn't, and I wasn't, but I used some resources coming, from different techniques. But then at the same time, people would, should I do work with this Brazilian guy who, I don't know, So I think that B helped legitimate this work, also using her academic background and interest. And she brought wonderful people that she knew to do this work. And then we started to have a pretty constant group of people who were interested in delving deeper on the Enneagram that way, and started to do that work more regularly. And then, when explaining about the arrow movements and, explaining the theory and integrating that more cognitively to the students, B helped a lot to give language to that. And another thing is that B helped energetically many times without knowing, because of important complementarities we have, the two of us. So I won't go into details, but we come from very complementary soul DNAs. And when I'm with her, I feel like there is more permission to go deeper. And I think it helps her too, to trust more her own intuition, which more recently has blown open too. So these are a few things that I can mention as an answer to your question, but there is more. So we started getting students who were really experienced in different sorts of work, and who were very ready to do that. But also with time, people would hear about it and would come without being as ready. And because of the amount of energy that was in there, and because people were not used in America, and not much used to body work and movement together with the Enneagram, maybe not as much, then, we noticed important differences in how different students would take that. And eventually, because it was getting deeper and deeper, and the transformation generated was very meaningful, then we started offering that mostly in a by invitation only way. And I think that was an important move. And later on, I also felt increasingly concerned, and so did B, with the fact that we would do weekend workshops, like 3-day workshops using this method. And then we would do just some follow-up informally through the internet, and not much. So there wasn't a process that deep experience was part of. And then people would come back months later, a year later, because then I was traveling to different parts of the world to do this work. And it would be like a year later, I would see some of those students, not all of them. So I started to be frustrated with the fact that we didn't have a self-development process. And then we created the two programs we have now on CP, the personal mastery and the professional certification. And the idea was to bring part of that method inside the personal mastery program, and use the mat mainly on the personal mastery, not as much in the professional certification. A little bit, but not much. And but then COVID came, and we can't really do mat work online. That's one of the main limitations of working virtually. And then we had to fuel in the content of those retreats of the personal mastery with other approaches. And then this new content was super important and worked well. And then we started seeing that maybe we can offer the way of the arrows and the way of the symbol as a complement to those students in separated, shorter workshops. And for us, what makes sense is that only students that have gone to one or two of our retreats attend it, because we don't want people to think that that work is all they need. And also, we don't want people to go there if they haven't done some more inner work in the ways we trust before. So we're gradually finding our way back to offering that. And I'm happy we're going to do a way of the symbol workshop in the US, perhaps soon one in London, definitely one in Brazil. Yeah, and we did one in Egypt. We'll do more, so it's happening.